And so what might become apparent is that what they're pointing at is that there is no doer. So instead of saying there is no doer, the teachings will say there is no person. Because the person includes the sense of doership so ingrained that in a way to undo the doer, you need to, in a way, disprove the person or the belief. If you talk about the person, by default you're dealing with the belief in doership. And from another perspective, we can see that actually, no, what they're talking about, there is no entity here. There is no objective person. That everything is a single arising, an experience. And if we see it as a single arising as an experience, then there's just experience. It's sort of like a sheet of paper. And if it includes 5 people drawn on the sheet of paper, we could say, look, there's a person there. And someone will say, actually, there is no person. There's just a sheet of paper with images on it. So there is an experience. What is experienced is the picture, let's say, on the piece of paper. And from one perspective, we could say there's no doubt that the experience is of 5 people or one person. And someone might want to point out the fact that don't focus just on the image, come to see that the 5 people or the one person is actually a piece of paper with an image on it. And all these different methodologies are really there to do something. What they end up doing is delivering change in what I would say in the end we acknowledge as the person who I am. And from a perspective where the methodologies have brought about change, and we acknowledge, I am the person, and I've been changed. And then I look back and I go, well, I was always the person. And before I was a person with certain features and characteristics, and some of those have been changed. And all the way through the process of change, I was the person being changed. And now I'm a person the way I am. And hopefully the process has changed us in such a way that we function in life differently to the way we did originally. And the difference that is very significant is the diminishing or ending of suffering. And how the change happens is sort of quite varied. So I was talking about different teachings pointing at different things. So in this teaching you'll see that what is spoken about is the belief in doership and attachment to outcome that the person has. So there is a person, and that person contains certain beliefs, certain skills. The person is as life has shaped them, and that can include some beliefs that cause some problems, beliefs that create certain reactions, internal reactions, when life unfolds a particular way. Now, this isn't to suggest that that's anyone's wrongdoing. It's just a description of what seems to be the case. And not even what seems to be, I'd just say it's a description of what's the case. There's a person, and we find that often in life the person doesn't seem to be equipped or designed to live life in a way that is peaceful. So we could say, I quite like this, is that if we drop the idea that, or the belief that comes along with certain spiritual teachings, that none of this is real. So once that's served its purpose, if we start questioning our experience of life and say, do I know that that's true? Do I know it's true, or have I just come to believe it's true because I've been told that this is the case by people I really respect, that I really trust? And when we're really objective and honest with the experience, I can't, even though there might be a shift in perception of life, a qualitative shift, and a shift that seemed to demonstrate the unreality of everything. And so because this shift happened, then things could be seen to be as described in certain teachings, we might come to believe, it is all unreal. And then if we become really present again with the experience and say, actually, let me just drop all of the concepts and let me just check right here, right now, whether I can confirm that this really is all unreal. That there is no person, that it's all an arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, a dream or a play. Let me just check if that's absolutely verifiable. And the more that we come back to the experience, we find that the experience is always telling us that this is an objective reality of time and space. It's always confirming, it's always functioning on the basis that this is an objective reality, and the framework of this reality is one of time and space. What I mean by that is objects always fall to the ground according to the laws of gravity. We always find ourselves moving in in practice from one place to another. And if someone challenges that, it's usually they're challenging it because they've taken on certain descriptions that says, well, it could be different to this. It could be that this is an elaborate hoax. This is an illusion. And I agree, it could be. If it was, it would be experienced exactly like this. But when we get told it could be, actually we don't get told so much it could be, we're told it is. To break our attachment to life being a particular way. Then we might come to believe, it is a hoax. Well, if it was a hoax, if it was an illusion, this is how it would feel. If it was an objective reality, guess what? This is how it would feel. So, I quite like the fact that whether it's all an illusion or not, the fact is, in practical terms, we have to live life as the human being, doing in each moment what needs to be done, and life continues to unfold according to laws of and rules of cause and effect. So we don't get things without there being a sequence of cause and effect. Whenever you investigate something, whether it's absolutely true or not, it will always appear that there is a causal reason for whatever happens in life. And in practical terms, we continue to live as if cause and effect is real, as if time and space is real, as if I am this body for the rest of our life, even after the most profound enlightenment. So the question is, well, actually, it's not really a question of is it an illusion or not. What to me is more important is, regardless of it, whether it is an illusion or not, we still have to live life as if it's real. Not pretending it's real, but in practical terms as if it's real. And so from this perspective, we can start to look at the transformation process that happens through spiritual seeking as part of the evolution of the human being. So let's say we always were the person. And we started off as a person with certain ingrained beliefs, a result of how life has shaped us. And then, as a result of human evolution, we find ourselves starting to think certain thoughts about our life. Some people in life aren't thinking these thoughts. So maybe thinking about the nature of life, which is really inspired by an uncomfortableness with life. When I say an uncomfortableness, it doesn't need to be an intense uncomfortableness. It can be, in my case, for example, there was just this sense that surely something's missing in life. Surely this isn't all that it's about. Getting from one objective and moving on to the next and then the next. And I felt that in particular because one particular objective that I set was delivered way ahead of expectation, not through any effort really of mine, but through good luck. And when I got this objective, that this was meant to be a 2-year objective, and it came within a period of, let's say, a month instead of 24 months. Within a few hours, I was setting a new objective, the next step up. An objective I imagined I would be setting in 2 years' time if I was lucky. And so if it's stretched out like that, you work hard for 2 years and you get where you want to go, and then you set up another 2-year. Maybe it seems like that makes sense. When the outcome was delivered in a very short period of time, without me making any great efforts, and I found myself automatically, within a space of hours, starting to think about the next objective. That's when it hit me, and it went, wow, this seems like a very shallow way of living life. That was my thought. Am I going to live life up to the age of 80 or 90 or 70 in this fashion, simply setting objectives and meeting them? And so there was a dissatisfaction when I realized this. It wasn't a strong dissatisfaction. It was like something just seemed a little weird. And so I started seeking. I had already started reading some books. And this really put it into practical terms, where from my own experience, I saw the futility of that sort of movement. And so then a certain thinking about spirituality happened more and more, driven by an innate questioning. So what if this movement is actually the evolution of the human being to a point where once we've managed to survive in life, the human being has evolved to a point where it now can survive quite easily on planet Earth. It's no longer needing to look over its shoulder to see if a tiger is going to eat us. And we don't need to wander extended periods of extended distances just to find our next meal, wondering if we're going to find water or food. So we've evolved to be able to survive, and what if the evolution is to evolve to surviving happily instead of surviving unhappily? And so this spiritual journey could be the evolution of the human. And it could be that certain humans are at the forefront of that wave of evolution. So where there's the humans that are being changed such that we find ourselves without any effort, but because of our makeup, living life happily, meaning at peace with life, compared to what seems to be the standard at the moment is surviving in life, yet not being at peace with life. And so, what if all of these spiritual teachings are simply there to bring about change of a real human being in an objective world? Who cares if we create some fancy stories? Let's just bring about the change. I agree. That's actually evolution at work. Evolution putting in place the teachings because it's understood what needs to be delivered to the human being in order to affect change. I'm talking about change on the level, frankly, of the neural network, let's say. Where we stop looking at life a particular way and we start looking at it differently. And the more that we look at it differently for an extended period of time, and the more that our attitude to what we're seeing changes, doesn't it make sense that maybe that starts changing the physiology of the human being to a physiology that can actually function in life differently than before? If this is a dream or an illusion, it's undoubtedly, when we look at it, an illusion that includes in it rules of causality in the most detailed way. So if we investigate with a microscope, which is all part of the illusion, if it's an illusion, meaning all part of the experience, all part of, I'm talking about a virtual world, let's say. So this could be a virtual reality, an experience. Now, it could be a virtual reality in the mind of an advanced civilization, or it could be a virtual reality in some formless God consciousness. Regardless of which it is, it's inside a consciousness. There needs to be a consciousness to recognize the creation. So when we hear that this is all a creation in consciousness, made of consciousness, recognized of consciousness, which we call God, God just really means that which is outside of the experience. So when the human being is having a dream, if we don't assume that the dream replaces the waking state experience, which is one way that we can look at it, is that the waking state experience collapses and the dream takes its place, because it's all in the consciousness of God. But if we look at it as though there actually is a human being, and now the human being is dreaming, a dream at night, then the dream is arising inside the consciousness of the human being, and guess what? The dreamer, the human being, is God to the characters in the dream world. That is God to the characters in the dream world. So when the characters in the dream world say, "Thank God that it started raining," they're talking about the consciousness and whatever created the experience of the dream. And if it is a dream, then it's a dream that undoubtedly includes detail of cause and effect on the most intricate level. So if we use a very powerful microscope or visual aid, scientific visual aid, to observe something on the minutest of detail. All of that's inside the dream, but what is seen is a story in the dream of cause and effect. And so sometimes from certain perspectives, if we talk about the brain producing thoughts, we're told there is no brain. There are just thoughts arising in consciousness. Everything spontaneously arises in consciousness. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not criticizing those teachings whatsoever. I put them forward sometimes. What seems to be happening more and more in spiritual circles, and we get to see it as we have access to more and more of what's inside people's head through Facebook in particular. You get people spew out what's in their head in Facebook comments and discussions. And what becomes very clear is when we see non-dual seekers throwing out what they've come to see so far, that is maybe some sort of, it's definitely a shift. It's definitely affected the neurology, the way I'm explaining, the neurology of the human being. But it hasn't necessarily gone where it needs to go. And so what's happening is spirituality is evolving, spiritual teachings are evolving to deal with the evolution of the human being on this level that we're speaking about, what we could call I don't even want to say the evolution of consciousness. And so a teaching will always do this. Any teaching in history will rebut an error that has formed in the brain. The teachings are not truth. They're there to attack an obstacle, to undo it with its opposite. And so when we start to see certain dysfunctions brought about by spiritual teachings need to adapt to deal with that. And one of the dysfunctions is the ingrained belief that there is no person, that there is no me as an individual. Now, if we define the me as something specific, then I'd agree there's no me. If the me is defined as me, a separate doer that's in control of everything that happens, then I see that's a fantasy. There's a person, but they are not in control. So from that point of view, I can say there is no me as a controller. But to go as far as say there's no me as a person, that's appropriate at a certain point. At some point we have to actually come back and say there is the experience of an individual, and there always will be an experience of an individual. So whether that experience ultimately is real or not is irrelevant. If we think that the experience of the individual is what falls away in enlightenment, then we should work very hard at seeing that there is no person. The fact from my experience is that that's not what falls away. The person, the experience of a person, the experience of being this body sitting on this couch as opposed to another body, that experience remains. And sometimes it remains, and we can become so convinced that there is no person that the belief that there is no person prevents us from actually acknowledging the experience as it actually remains. It's crazy. It shows the power of belief, where we will go round insisting there is no person. And at some point, so this happened when I went to meet Ramesh in, I don't know, it was 2005, I think, 2006. Well, I met him in 2005, but and we had a discussion because he had asked me what brought you here, and I said it was the teachings of Nisargadatta, his guru, and he was interested in knowing what my take of those teachings were. And I had been with those teachings, and they had a profound effect on how I saw life, radical shifts, realizations of a consciousness, a being that I previously hadn't recognized. And I think Ramesh by now had become very clear that his teaching was really there to correct some of these spiritual beliefs that get put in place when listening to certain teachings. Now, once again, not the teaching's fault. The teaching is not flawed. It is just about how we end up interpreting the teaching at a certain point in time. It's an inevitability. If the teaching says certain things in a certain way, we're going to believe them. But the teaching has to say them in that way. So there's not really an error. It's all happening as it's meant to happen. But then we do see that there is an error on one level, is that the concepts in the teaching have done their job, but they then get taken the wrong way or held on to the wrong way. And so Ramesh was already clear that there's a lot of confusion, people coming out of certain teachings. So that's why he asked me, I'm interested, tell me, what's your understanding about Nisargadatta's teaching? And so we had a chat, and it was all about the non-dual, it's all an illusion arising in consciousness, which I really had embodied. I couldn't see life differently. It was that I'm not making it up, it's not conceptual, it's just how I see life. And so actually I think I put a good account forward of Nisargadatta's teachings based on my own experiential way of seeing life. And essentially it was all there is consciousness. And at the end of that description, Ramesh said, so tell me, who is speaking to whom? And I said, well, you could say consciousness is speaking to consciousness, and consciousness is listening to consciousness. And Ramesh leaned forward and he said, Roger, don't be ridiculous. Roger is speaking to Ramesh, and Ramesh is listening, and then Ramesh speaks to Roger, and Roger listens. And I was a little shaken. And I was thinking, no, this can't be right. It's taken 4 years of being intensely immersed in these teachings, both Nisargadatta's and Ramana's teachings, and before that, A Course in Miracles, to really come to see that there is no Roger and there is no Ramesh. That all there is arisings in consciousness that are continually coming and going, meaning there is a consciousness that to me seemed constant, what we could describe as a background that doesn't ever change, and then the imagery is always changing, and the imagery is the experience of life, and the person is simply part of the imagery, and the feelings and the thoughts and the words are all part of the multisensory imagery created on this background of awareness, and it is the awareness in which everything arises, everything made of that same awareness, no separation between that which arises and the awareness that sees it. That is the experience of life. That's how I had come to see it, deeply, no question. And there was a lot of peace. And So I couldn't reconcile this because it didn't seem like I had a concept of this. It felt like actually my previous concepts about life being a reality had fallen away. And as my previous concepts of life being a reality fell away, suddenly I, what you could say, have awoken to reality, to seeing life as it is, without a filter of belief. And so the only way I could reconcile what Ramesh was saying, that there is a Roger and there is a Ramesh, is to say, well, everything is made of consciousness. And so really what he's saying is Roger is consciousness and Ramesh is consciousness. That's the only way I could palate him saying there is a Roger and there is a Ramesh. And I don't know if he said, no, that's not what I mean, or whether it intuitively was sensed that I can't just use that rationalization. So once again, like has happened many times with my relationship with Ramesh, I said, I think he doesn't know. He doesn't quite get it. And the conversation in my head just kept going over and over until I realized I can't admit that there is a Roger. I can't bring myself to say the words, there is Roger. And when I realized that, it was like Roger was realizing that Roger couldn't say that Roger existed. And in that moment, I had this realization based on the fact that I couldn't even say the words. That there was a belief in place that was preventing me to see what was still there, to see the experience on a level that still existed. It was very much like me going around saying, there is no house, it's just a pile of bricks. And not being able to acknowledge the house, the form, simply because it had been highlighted to me through a process that actually there are just bricks. Everything is bricks. And you're calling it and seeing it as a house. And when I realized I wasn't able to affirm that the pile of bricks happened to be in the form of a house and happened to serve a purpose of sheltering me, etc., then I realized, wow, I'm stuck. And so this realization, insight, was the beginning of a letting go of the top-down or the certain recognitions of the nature of life. And even when I say that, the nature of life or the fundamental essence of life, now if we look at it really closely, we see it doesn't prove that everything is actually made of consciousness. What was seen, the awakening, just means, well, if there's an objective reality, there is a real world, and I'm a body, a person in a real world, then what is seen in the world is picked up by the eyes, so light off the objects is picked up there, and then it's projected into the brain. So I'm just talking about the visual aspect. And so where the image of life is recognized is inside consciousness. It seems like I'm seeing life outside of me. I'm seeing the world that is there. And on the one hand, you can say, if there is an objective, I am seeing the world that is there. But where am I seeing it? What am I seeing? I'm seeing an image of the world that is out there, always inside the consciousness that recognizes it. And let's say, in this case, the consciousness of the person. And so these shifts in awareness that happen could actually be, so, we hear, if you were the object, if you were the body, you wouldn't be able to perceive it. If you were the thoughts, you wouldn't be able to perceive it. So that which you can perceive is not what you are. But what if all of this is the image of an external world projected into the consciousness of the person that exists in the external world? Then what we see will be image inside consciousness. Or what we experience is image inside consciousness. And therefore these shifts where consciousness seems to witness could actually be, and that was the case before any shifts, before the spiritual seeking, it was still the image of an external world inside, where the experience of life is always going to be registered inside the brain/mind of the person. And so these shifts in consciousness could actually be shifts of the person's consciousness. So it doesn't prove that there is no objective reality. It doesn't prove that there is. So it is all an arising in consciousness, but it doesn't mean that what is arising in consciousness isn't a reflection of an objective world that actually does exist. So how is this all significant? Bottom line is, what we're looking for as human beings in this movement, that is not a movement that we're dictating, but on the one hand, if you look at it as a unfolding of an experience, it's a story created to unfold exactly as it's unfolding. And in that story, what's the movement? The movement is towards happiness in daily living. And if it's an objective reality, then we can look at it as evolution, which is part of that objective reality, moving towards happiness. So, happiness turns out, in this experience, objective reality or virtual reality, illusion, whatever you want to call it, turns out to be the end of suffering. And suffering, when we look at it in practical terms, arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And when you look at the base of the guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, what we find there is a ground on which that suffering stems from, or flowers from, grows from. And the ground is the belief that I am in control of everything I think, say, and do, that the other is in control of everything I think, say, and do, and that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And the humans that have been changed sufficiently will tell you, actually it turns out that happiness is available in this life, and it's available when certain beliefs fall away. Certain beliefs fall away, and then certain reactions to life fall away. And because those reactions fall away, what we find is that certain content of our experience isn't there anymore. And the content is, in general terms, an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. The falling away of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And from that place, it becomes very clear that my happiness is not dependent on life suddenly changing to some amazing mystery where, yes, paradise where everything is pleasurable. These human beings that are there telling us happiness is available for us as a race or as a species. It's available, and it's available with life remaining as it is. Sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Which really means your happiness isn't to be found in life being all pleasure. It's got much more to do with our attitude to life, our reaction to life, our reaction to circumstance. And it comes with not only recognizing that my completeness is already here, I just need to stop reacting to life as if it is an attack on my completeness, which it turns out not to be. As well as that falling away, the suffering falls away with a recognition that what happens through me is much more automatic and dictated by factors outside of my control. That I'm designed by life to have a mental challenge or to have mental clarity, to be clever in one subject and not so good in another subject, and I function exactly the way that I've been designed by life. It's automatic. The feeling of hunger arises not because I suddenly ring a bell and say, I'm now going to feel hungry. It happens. And tiredness happens. And biological reactions happen, and psychological reactions happen. Not because we choose for them to happen as a separate volitional chooser, but rather we're designed for life to continually act as a stimuli and create a response. And so then if we appreciate this, then when in a particular moment we function in a way that is not brilliant, let's say, there's a witnessing of that functioning as much less personal than I previously related to it. And that's what allows my attitude to it to change. It doesn't make the outcome more pleasurable. The outcome is still painful, let's say. I functioned in a way that's not optimal and the outcome was not brilliant. It doesn't change that, but it means my attitude to that functioning can be much more relaxed, can be much more objective, much more rational. And that means I'm going to see the other the same way. A human being designed to function in a moment exactly as they function.
I know that's a doer question.
Yeah, so the question is, how do we change this? Meaning,
Someone who's literally they're dying.
Let's just use the microphone.
Again and again and again, and no matter like how much intervention, no matter how much willingness, no matter how much insight, no matter how much awareness, there's still a constant return. And so while there's like a piece to accepting that this is, and it's like a compassionate awareness as well, like this is not my doing, I don't choose to do this. There also must be, like if creation is made us, that means creation is within us, and that means all solutions are within us. I very much.
I don't know, that's a big...
Okay. Well, I think if that which creates is what I am, then that solution must also be within. And so while there can be an acceptance that this is how I am, there's also a healthy desire to adjust what doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And a natural frustration that can occur when repetition occurs despite awareness. It's almost like having like a shake, and you can't stop it. Mm-hmm. And yet you know it's possible somehow, but you can't.
See, maybe you believe it's possible, And if you believe it's possible, then you're going to get frustrated because you're going to say, I believe it's possible and I can't stop it. Right? What if it's not possible?
Sometimes you can stop it.
No,
or
sometimes it stops.
Sometimes it stops, yeah.
Right? So what if you continue to believe that when it stopped, you stopped it? It's a bit like...
I believe conditions happen around me that usually alter my perception. So like, I don't know how specific to get.
I agree. But when you look at that, you see that they're not things that were in your control. That sometimes factors line up such that the stopping happens. And other times...
Easily.
And other times, no matter what efforts you or other people put in, it doesn't stop. So this is akin to when we toss a coin 10 times and it comes up heads 6 times and we call heads. So we get 6 times, we get what we want. I'm using this example because it can be clear to think. If we think that 6 out of 10 times I was in control because 6 out of 10 times I got what I wanted, it's an error. As we come to see it clearly, we go, 6 times I got what I wanted, but 10 out of 10 times I wasn't in control. And so what you're saying is correct, but what if this belief that I can affect my own change?
Because, Roger, I think what I struggle with and what I think I've heard other people struggle with is because there is the consciousness and awareness of a choice. Like whether it's picking up a bite of food or someone who's struggling with alcohol or someone who's struggling with smoking. It's like you can say I'm powerless, and yet at the same time I'm still choosing to pick this up despite my awareness that this doesn't serve me long term. But the need for it in the moment supersedes this awareness about what's best for me. And that is the moment of choice that I think makes it difficult to not take responsibility on some level.
Yeah, so what is being put forward here is if I stopped it where we were, it sounds like, well, this is a teaching that's going to create helplessness and despair. So it's very important to see the particulars. Why does someone keep going back into their cycles of addiction, let's say? Even with all of the assistance and all of their own willpower, let's say, and willingness.
Or even emotional attachments if it's not a substance. Like anything that you know isn't going to turn out well.
Yep. So why does someone keep returning, keep functioning that way? The answer, according to this, is because they're designed by life, and the explanation is based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning that make them think and feel exactly the way that they do in each moment, or we do. So this is a general explanation about how everyone experiences life in each moment and functions. We do it because we are functioning according to our makeup. And we weren't in control of our makeup. And so this might not be something that on the surface sounds palatable, especially to the one that believes they're in control, wants to be in control, because this is telling you you are not in control. But it's not as disparaging as it may sound on the surface. So these are just descriptions. And they're not meant to create despair. They don't have to create despair. If they did, then I think you might as well keep the description to yourself. Or I could keep it to myself. If it just was a description and didn't provide a solution within it as well. Then what's the point of saying it? But it doesn't...
I don't feel despair with the teaching. I just feel in my life, and as I see in other people's, that there's an unwillingness to live in the randomness that sometimes it will stop and sometimes it will start. That there needs to be, that there's a desire for a transformation that transcends this constant stop and start. And that it's possible because I myself have experienced and transcended certain things that no longer trouble me. And I've seen other people do the same.
Well, So
Or maybe
this
I'm
is
not
the
saying
question.
I did it, like
Yeah,
me,
that's right.
but life
So
did it.
it's possible it happens,
Yes.
but how did it happen? Right? Did it happen because you controlled the happening?
It was a dropping of beliefs, I guess, over time.
Yeah. And who dropped the beliefs? Right?
Life dropped the beliefs.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. And so on the one hand, you could say, well, the beliefs that I held were dropped. So we can say, I dropped the beliefs. That I can run with that. But we also need to see the dynamics of the dropping of beliefs. And then we can say, I dropped the beliefs, but it wasn't my doing. It was a happening. And so what this message says is that happiness for the human being, the end of suffering, is available. It is something that can happen. So if we go back, why does someone go into the cycle? Because they're forced to. Their destiny is for that to happen for as long as life has them shaped a particular way. And life is always changing our shape. Life is always changing our genetics and up-to-date conditioning by delivering new conditioning in each moment. And so when life delivers new conditioning, that new conditioning can make the situation worse, or it can make it better, depending on what the new conditioning is and how it affects our up-to-date conditioning. And so if we see this dynamic, that the person is forced to go into that cycle over and over because they're shaped by life to do that, and we see that someone is forced to come out of that cycle, forced to be free because life shapes them to break out of the cycle, then the question of how can I affect the change, right? That might be seen to be no longer a valid question. How can I affect the change if we see that life affects the change?
Yes. And yet I know, like, if I do certain things, I'm always going to change my state.
Yeah, but when you do certain
Life is changing
things,
my state,
yeah.
but I have to have the willingness to go and do it. I have to the willingness to go outside.
Where do you get the willingness from?
Usually, like, either just my common sense or desperateness because I avoided my common sense for too long.
But so where does your common sense come from, or your desperateness come from?
I mean, that's, I guess, expressions of life through me.
Yeah,
Expressions of
exactly.
life through me.
So in a particular moment, you feel a desperateness, or common sense functions. And the desperateness is because, once again, the feeling of life is the way it is, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the desperateness is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the desperateness creates a subsequent reaction of moving in a different way, let's say, to normal. Or the desperateness will get you to move in the same way as normal. That's in general terms, we'll just say however we move is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning what we believe is my movement is much more automatic than we thought. And so the common sense, once again, is based on being programmed by life in order for you to be able to assess a situation and make a certain decision. So what seems like my conscious choice to stop cigarettes, let's say.
That's not my thing, but okay.
Huh? No. But let's say someone is smoking and one day they say, they have a feeling, a thought arises, I don't want to smoke anymore. That thought may well arise because they've just watched a video that shows a dead man, smoking man's lungs being opened up. And they see inside compared to a non-smoking set of lungs. And it's like the visual image is like, wow, that's new conditioning. If that conditioning hadn't been delivered in their life, then the thought that says, I consciously make this decision now to stop smoking, may not have arisen. That thought, I consciously choose not to smoke, is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning up to that particular point in time. And so life is always shaping us. So if we find ourselves listening to descriptions about how life works, and the description includes a concept that says, the part of us that wants to be the driver of life is actually the very root of the suffering that the question asks, how can I get rid of it? So I'll repeat that. The part of us that has been conditioned by life to want to be the driver of life is the very root of the suffering that drives the question that says, how can I stop this suffering? So if that is understood and recognized, what will the controller of life, which really deep down just wants the best, but if it really realizes that it is the problem, what will it do? If it really wants the best,
It will, I don't want to say, but it will die.
it will lie down and die. It'll say, I need to stop. And essentially what is saying all of these things is the intellect. The intellect asks the question, how can I stop this suffering that I've heard is a potential in life? The end of suffering is a potential for all human beings. It's our birthright. So how can I stop it? That's the intellect saying that. And let's separate the intellect into the working mind and the thinking mind. The question is actually coming from the thinking mind, which is the part of the intellect that has been conditioned to believe it is the doer and that its happiness is to be found in life. So, and it's not wrong, it's inaccurate, but it's when the question is asked, it's inevitable for it to be asked when that part of the intellect is still programmed that way. And then the concepts are put forward, and I'm talking to the working mind, the part of the intellect that can understand the concepts I'm putting forward. And if the working mind continues to function such that its understanding goes deeper and deeper, to the point where it really recognizes, based on its own observation of the internal landscape, its own observation of the suffering as it arises, and sees it really is all based on the functioning of essentially the same intellect, which I've categorized into two, the thinking mind and the working mind. If the working mind, which has been appropriately equipped, not by Roger, but by life functioning through Roger, so life delivering new conditioning, and it sees time and time again, wow, it's the belief in doership and my attachment to outcomes that is the suffering that is creating this uncomfortableness in life. So then we can see that they're actually not two minds, it's all the one mind, one with some misunderstanding, the other with the understanding. So it's when the working mind is strongly enough programmed with a clear understanding of the problem that the mind itself says, that's the laying down of the intellect. The intellect says, I just have to stop. And that stopping means, in a way, something, you lie down on the floor. with your arms spread wide. When you're on the floor, you can't do anything. You're like a turtle on its back. Right? And you just say, I stop. I give up. Not in desperation, like I give up in despair.
This is like the basis of the 12-step movement, in a way.
Right.
Like the first step is you're powerless.
Mm-hmm.
And then you come to believe that a power greater than yourself can restore you. And then you decide to give your will and your life over to that. I mean, this is how like millions of people recover.
Mm-hmm.
But even in that, there can be a sense of doing in a way.
Sure. There will be, often we think we're surrendering, but it's the doer surrendering in order to get something. Right? Oh, I have to surrender, and then I'll get peace. Okay, I'll do surrendering. You know, it's the attachment to the peace that is still the thinking mind trying to negotiate or do what it should. And if that gets caught by the working mind, when the working mind has really been programmed to see all of the doership in action, they start getting caught out by the same mind that says, wow, I'm functioning in a way that is not optimal. And how this happens, the pace at which it happens, the effectiveness with which it happens is really not in our control. But when I say that, it can sound terrible. The more that we realize it's not in my control, meaning the working mind recognizing the mechanics of life, which then also recognizes that if the working mind starts to function in a particular moment appropriately, so the working mind can say, I'm going to go to satsang today. Right? So you still have to, this surrendering of doership doesn't mean that you will stop making decisions. It's just that hopefully now the decisions get made with the right attitude, meaning the attitude of the working mind rather than that of the thinking mind. So the thinking mind effectively is attached to outcomes. I'm going to do this in order to get that. The working mind says, well, I feel like going to satsang, or it makes sense that how things are going to change is by life delivering new conditioning. Where do I receive this new conditioning? I receive it in satsang. At some point, the working mind will say, I've received enough of this new conditioning in satsang, and I'm going to go to the beach, because actually the conditioning now needs to go deeper and deeper in daily living, where I'm not even that focused on the change happening. And when that happens, it's actually a sign of a very deep understanding and non-doership. It's like, I don't even need to go to satsang anymore.
So last thing I'll say on this is like, what if you find yourself in the place where you can witness your thinking mind and the working mind, and then from there there's a choice, like almost like to be swayed by one or the other, and then there's almost a feeling of conflict because there's still a desire to go with thinking mind because there's still a pleasure that's associated with it that's quite strong.
Mm-hmm.
But then working mind, which has had enough time in life now leading, is also quite alluring because we know that's where the freedom lives. But I'm still at times pulled by the pleasures of my thinking mind, and almost like it's like a compulsive need to receive something in that moment. Mm. So what do you do like when you're walking down the street and then you have that choice between the two? What do you do?
No, in that case, when you say what do you do, that to me doesn't imply how can I change it. It can be just a description of what happens through the body then. See, because I'm not going around going, I don't do anything, I don't exist. The choices, the life still unfolds through choices, which turn out not to be as much my choice as a controller, but rather a choice based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So really what I put forward is more a description of an attitude rather than how you should or shouldn't live life. Because if I were to tell you this is what you should do, that's assuming that your makeup in that moment is designed for you to do that. Because if your makeup in that moment isn't designed for you to do what I say you should do.
But if it's for the highest good, I think inside of us, we each know what's intrinsically good for us and what's not. And that's why there's conflict and suffering, is because when we do something that's intrinsically not good for us, we know it and we feel it, and there's suffering because it's like I'm trying to make myself feel better and I'm hurting myself. I'm contributing to my own pain by doing this, and there's conflict.
So I'd say in each moment, do what you feel like doing, right? Being aware of the fact that there's a conflict, two roads you could go down, two choices you could make. And I would say do whichever one you feel like doing, which means at some point one is going to win over the next. And do that. And then you might say, well, what if that's the one that is the thinking mind? I'd say that's okay, because you're making the choice with awareness of the fact that you're doing what you feel like doing. So in the moment you're aware of the fact that how your choice is going to be made is based on what you feel like. And that feel like doesn't necessarily mean just the desire. That the desire in one could be very strong, but your overall feeling could be there's a strong desire to do that, but there's a strong understanding that that's not good for me. And so overall, what you feel like might be to go away from the desire. Or if you might know that's not good for me, but the desire is so strong that overall you say, well, I feel like following my desire. And it's simply... Or
I don't feel like following my desire, but I feel compelled to anyway. Like I don't even feel like doing this, but I feel I'm almost compelled to.
Yes. So what I'm meaning by what you feel like is simply a question of the different intensities of all sorts of different things at play. And the ones with the most intensity will end up winning. So you could have the intention to be faithful in a relationship, and let's say that intention has a certain weight, and then a desire comes, you find yourself in a situation and there's a desire to be unfaithful, a biological desire, and there's no question what will happen. It's, in my mind, it's simply about the different intensities. If the intensity to be unfaithful, the desire to be with someone other than your partner, is strong enough, it will win over the intention to be faithful. Only if it breaks the threshold. Once it goes above the threshold, it wins. Once it's below the threshold, the intention to be faithful wins. And this is just a description of dynamics.
It just feels like there's no hope for humanity. And that like we all have one of these things. I mean, we could make a list and everyone in this room would have one thing on the list at least. And well, so then it's like...
Yeah, except what we can find is that the desire that used to be so strong may actually be part of a psychological, part of our makeup on a psychological level. So as that dissolves, these desires that drive us in ways that turn out not to be great for us, we see from our experience, they start to fall away. And so then we might find that without effort, we can do what we feel like, and it doesn't cause huge amounts of problems. So why I say do what you feel like is because it's not, I'm not telling anyone how they should or shouldn't live. I'm simply saying there's a mechanism inside that is going to drive you in each situation. Follow that, knowing that that's destiny unfolding. If you do it with an awareness of the fact that you're making your choice based on what you feel like, and that means you might actually be oscillating for a few minutes or a day or 2 days even, making a decision about that. And what it means is the awareness is you're aware of the different components inside. driving you in different directions. And even if you go down a path that is driven by the thinking mind, the fact that you're aware of your internal landscape, and also the awareness will then be interested in the consequences, means that the movement in the direction that the thinking mind is sending you, which is most likely going to have a result that you don't feel great about afterwards, means you'll feel that sense of uncomfortableness afterwards, and it will then add to the up-to-date conditioning that says these movements in that direction don't actually in practice give me a great result, contrary to what it says it's going to give me in the feeling. And what can happen is, if there's no awareness on this dynamic, is we can do things over and over again without ever really registering the full set of consequences of an action, and never really being able to see for ourselves how this movement isn't delivering something positive. So the more and more we bring attention, without trying to control, I'm just going to live as I feel like. I'll have to accept the consequences of that. There will be consequences. Already there's a surrender there to non-doership, a surrender to the fact I'm being lived by my desires, let's say, sometimes, which is unfortunate, but it's a fact of life. So imagine being a drug addict and actually surrendering to the fact that you're being lived in the direction of being a drug addict, not your doing. Now someone would say, well, that's terrible, then the drug addict's never going to stop. I'd say actually it's probably the beginning of the end of their drug addiction. For as long as the drug addict is convinced that they are failing, then the shame that is being added to the already intense load, which is probably the load that is driving their addiction. It's a load of shame that is driving their addiction. If their attitude is, oh, I'm a failure because I continue to use drugs and I should be able to stop it, that's the same shame that's driving the drug. As soon as that stops, it's like, I can't help but live life this way. We see now the dynamic of shame on the outside has changed. And the thinking mind simply can't comprehend that this could be a positive thing. Like for the person to surrender into being addicted to something. But the funny thing is that the addiction that carries on when someone doesn't surrender. So in Alcoholics Anonymous is the saying, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. Which really means maybe changing your attitude is the change that means you'll get something different.
Also like a fellowship that's based upon accountability, which is like, it's basically like, I can't do this by myself. I am like dependent on other people, and because the power greater than myself works through these people. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not in AA, but I have familiarity with this from something else. So it's like there's still a dependency on the group. Mm-hmm. Where we could say in this, I mean, in satsang, we are creating that space together. Mm-hmm. But ultimately in awakening, there's not saying there's a dependency on a group.
No, so these are, in a way, what you've identified as some similar principles, but they're different in, maybe not radically different, but some contexts are quite different. And so, yes, maybe the dependency is not being reinforced here. And that's not to say that it being reinforced in AA is a problem. Sometimes certain, not sometimes actually, certain patterns of the human condition need to be dealt with very specific approaches. And so, frankly, if someone was an addict and they said, I've come because I'm an addict, I'd say, well, you're very welcome. I see no reason why these concepts couldn't penetrate all the way to the bottom of your addiction if they're understood deeply. However, the intensity of the belief in personal doership can sometimes prevent the direct pointer from being absorbed. And if that's the case, then it is just much more appropriate for someone to go through a different methodology that has developed specifically by understanding the dynamics of certain conditions. And then after someone has been loosened up by a program or whatever, then they might find themselves in satsang and it can hit. So I really don't subscribe to the idea that there's one place for everyone. All of these things to me dovetail into each other and support each other. Mm. Yeah. Um, 6 o'clock, good. In 3 minutes, okay. Have you got something you'd like to share, Laura? If you do, you have to use the microphone. But don't feel under pressure.
So, it was on. Okay. So, I have been with Roger last year's retreat for 3 weeks. We have been, and I felt that the teaching ran me through a whole circle, and now, or like this maybe, and now I'm at the same point where I have started before Australia, and that's why I'm here. And I've realized how much for me my belief in doership was using the teaching also. Like there was like on one level the working mind has been equipped and got deeper in, but it was like a second listener and a second thinker also working its way. And yeah, so interesting. That's just my report so far. Mm-hmm. And I'm quite happy to be here now for maybe 2 weeks. That's it. Yes.
So that means that the thinking mind grabbed hold of the concepts and started using them as something it wanted to do and it wanted to achieve, which is inevitable or very likely to happen when the doership belief is there. But if the working mind then recognizes that this is the dynamic that has happened, that is a further recognition of the functioning of doership, which doesn't mean it will necessarily end straight away, but it's at least now come under the spotlight. And what's important, I think, is to use, what I suggest is to use suffering and peace of mind as your guides to keep you on track, to keep you focused on investigating things on a practical level. So if we become familiar with what the suffering feels like, what peace of mind feels like, then whenever the suffering is there, the working mind can ask the question, so what is going on here? What dynamic is in play? Not with the intention of ending it. Because if we say, if we have that intention of, okay, how can I stop this? That's more of the thinking mind. If the working mind is simply interested in understanding the dynamic, allowing, in fact, that means that if I'm going to understand the dynamic, I need the dynamic to carry on. I need the suffering to carry on so that I can feel it and see it. And it's just interested in understanding the dynamic. That process itself is part of the seeing of what suffering is, what the mechanics of suffering is, and the question is, who is doing the seeing? What it turns out when we see is that the suffering is essentially new conditioning in the moment that awareness recognizes. That suffering inspires a thought that says, what exactly is going on here? That thought is there because satsang might have suggested that this is useful, to be interested in what the dynamic is. So the thought comes up, actually, what's going on? And then awareness lands on the circumstance, which essentially then becomes new conditioning. So awareness seeing that there is an uncomfortableness with life because of a fear of what's going to happen next. So there's worry. And the working mind can see, oh, there's worry. So it confirms that suffering, one of the forms of suffering is worry. And what is the worry based on? It's based on a fear of what circumstance might present next. And it's seen that the fear is there because there's a belief that my completeness is dependent on circumstance. So this observing is this feedback loop of new conditioning and up-to-date conditioning working together. And so who is doing the observing and the questioning? It's really just the mind, which is part of an instrument. The person is a biological instrument, and the brain is part of that biological instrument that is simply functioning as it's being created to function. And so we can actually allow the working mind to function, and if we understand that it's the working mind functioning, doesn't need a me to be driving that working mind, it'll function on its own. And we can witness the thinking of the working mind as a happening, not my doing. And that in itself is a great understanding of how change happens. So the change happens through the working mind functioning and recognizing things. The working mind saying, okay, that's it. I'm not going to make those sort of decisions anymore. And we could then say, that's my decision. Understanding it's actually the decision of the working mind, but the experience is that that's my mind and me. And that's going to stay, that experience, it's my mind and me, it's fine. It's simply understanding the deeper mechanics of non-doership, which allows a witnessing to happen. And as that witnessing is happening, it also understands the functioning of the thinking mind as just mechanics happening. And so the suffering, when it arises, can be witnessed as a happening.
Yes, and I have also made the observation that exactly it's like I have the feeling that the thinking mind is really, for myself, very deeply on the biological level connected to the survival instinct.
Mm-hmm.
So, and exactly this this movement of investigation, of observing, it sometimes goes like because this is what I loved about these recent Facebook posts you were sharing, because you really pointed out this to me very I think very juicy point of evolution. And really this is something I have the feeling as well. It's like this thinking mind and the survival mechanism, they go like this. and it's about that the survival mechanism stops on a biological level as well, and that's what I feel why it is also such an intense process on some level. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and even when you were talking right now, like giving an answer, I had to focus a lot that I even understand what you were talking of, because it immediately happens that something doesn't want to listen then. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was just interesting. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
So I feel that these non-dual teachings, they kill the excitement of life. So once through certain experiences, it's understood that happiness is not to be found in outcomes. You are just not interested in the outcomes any longer, because you sort of know it's not going to bring you any happiness. So you don't really look forward for it. It's just that the excitement which you initially had prior to non-dual teachings is just not there. Like initially, you would be excited for stuff. You'd be excited to go meet your friends, go out for a drink. For such little stuff, you would be excited to do that. But then, it's just gone.
You speaking for me or for yourself?
I'm speaking for myself.
Okay. Because for myself, as the understanding deepens, what happens is that an integrated way of living in life happens. And so what you say is correct. There is this process where the attachment to outcomes is being broken, that life needs to create a lack of motivation to engage in activities that we were previously very motivated to engage in. It needs to do that to show us that we actually still exist, even without engaging in those activities. It needs to show us that not only do I just exist, but that there is something very significant that is independent from those activities. Now, if that aspect of ourself isn't revealed, if the peace isn't revealed, what we might find is that this spiritual desert, this gap between sort of having left one shore where we were in the place of being convinced that my happiness is to be found in outcomes and activities, and so we would get very excited when things were going well because we'd have a psychological boost, and then depressed when things don't go well. Then we've sort of been told, no, it's not like that. And you see to some extent that this seeking after appreciation, some sort of vanity and stuff like that is a bit shallow. And so we stop doing that. But we haven't quite got the benefits of getting to the other side. As the peace starts settling in, it really means we're getting the fruits, let's say, of having left one side and going on to the other side. And to the extent where that hasn't happened, we're in the middle. A bit like, I don't know if you remember in The Matrix, in the show, the movie The Matrix, there was one of the guys that had sort of decided he wanted out of the illusion, so he became part of the Matrix team. And at some point he was saying, this is nonsense, I want to go back. And he said, I don't care if the taste of the steak it's all an illusion. I just want what I had back, please. And so he, betrayed the good guys in exchange for being reinserted back into the illusion. Right? He said, I was promised something, and I haven't got it. I think what I was promised is a load of nonsense. What I had even though you're telling me it was all an illusion and I see it was all an illusion, basically it's better than this. Stick me back there, please. And that, I guess, makes sense. You often have a lot of people feeding back going, you know, this, I just feel completely lost. I can't believe anymore in the old way. And yet what I have in place of it is nothing special, nothing to write home about.
Yeah.
So that's sort of...
The point that I had.
So that's the spiritual limbo, let's say, where the process is working because it's dissolving the attachment, which is, if the attachment to outcomes remains in place, then we're never going to experience what its alternative can be. So it's working, it's just not working where the alternative is delivered particularly quickly. So in some of the wisdom teachings in the Indian Hindu scriptures, there is reference to the bogi being the unenlightened person, or bogi, meaning enjoyer, the enjoyer of pleasures. That's the enlightened being. And then somewhere else in the same area, they refer to the enlightened person as being a mahabogi, a super enjoyer. Now that make you scratch your head. Like the unenlightened is the enjoyer, meaning if someone is attached to outcomes, attached to pleasure, believing that their completeness is to be found in pleasure, they are considered unenlightened. And then it says the enlightened is a super enjoyer, the mahabogi. Why is that the case? Why it's the case is that after the attachment to pleasure has fallen away, the enlightened person no longer resists pleasure, understands that with the attitude that is no longer believing one's completeness is to be found in outcomes, it's understood that the flow of life is still going to be pleasure and pain. And so when pleasure comes, I will enjoy it fully, without any thoughts about what will happen when this pleasure is over. And so what it means is that you can get given a chocolate cake and you go, oh yes, that's in line with my biological preferences. And we see the body eating and tasting and it's, oh, this is so good. Like I'm fully present with the chocolate cake, let's say. Fully present really meaning that the guilt and blame and shame and expectation and worry and anxiety that normally fill the system up, that disturb the enjoyment of pleasure as pleasure, that's not there. And so then the flow of life continues. Well, not life in general has two levels. It's got the flow of life, which is pleasure and pain, which remains there, and our attitude to the pleasure and pain. So in fact, I would say, that's why I said, are you speaking for yourself or for me? Because what I found is that the non-dual teachings at a certain phase do have the effect that you're talking about, where we become disinterested in order to break the attachment. It's very similar to the process of renunciation. And there's a reason for that renunciation, so that the monk eventually realizes, wow, I can feel the core of my essence, the core of the human being. I am, I exist. And they rest there more and more often and feel more and more joyful or peaceful, complete. And they realize, wow, I have this without my hair and without fancy clothes, without good food, with a hard bed, cold showers. And I still have this pristine I am. And so once that's settled in and it's understood, this I am, I exist, is there without all of these fancy things, the monk really can hang up his cloak and go back out into daily living and still be very familiar with, wow, I am in every moment, and I can have chocolate cake and it doesn't disturb my I amness. And when someone takes the last piece of chocolate cake before I get to have some, I am. I reckon I am. I don't need chocolate cake. I am. And yet, if there's chocolate cake, I am, and I can enjoy the chocolate cake.
So you're saying until I've completely dissolved into the non-dual teachings, I'm going to be feeling unexcited and boring.
Well, you might have that urge not to do anything. You might just not have the urge to go out on a Friday night. But mind you, I'm not saying that don't go out on a Friday night until the non-dual teachings have completely sunk in. I'm saying do what you feel like. So if you feel like going out on a Friday night, go out and enjoy if you can.
Let's just feel unexcited and bored.
You feel unexcited and bored. Well, you see that why is that? It's just a result of your makeup at this point in time. And it could be, as you say, it could be a direct result of teachings that have told me my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, and some deep intuition that says that's true. Because if you don't have the intuition that that's true, then I guess you'd say, well, that's what the teaching says, but screw that, I'm still going to go and enjoy pleasure. So the lack of motivation is there. One of the reasons I say it's there is to give us space from our old way of living life, which tended not to give us space to consider and to contemplate these things, not to give us space for certain suppressed energies to rise. So the old way was full of distractions and activity. And so life can create a boredom, a lack of motivation, sometimes as a way of keeping you in a situation that allows what needs to happen to happen. That's the optimistic way of looking at it. And I don't mean just optimistic. I actually think if you observe what happens in that space, there's a familiarity with our inner landscape that maybe wasn't there before.
Just a metaphor comes to mind with this question. Somewhere I had read that if there's a candle in the room and it's lit, it makes a huge difference when there's darkness around. And then when you open the curtains and the sunlight floods in, it really doesn't matter if the candle is lit or not. I mean, it's not the primary source of your light. It's just a thing.
Yeah, that's very
your
good.
Comments on that.
Yeah. So the candle in this instant refers to the pleasure. And I guess it's saying, like, if we're starved of nutrition from anywhere else, then the pleasures seem very significant. And if we then start to find that we recognize a source of nutrition that has always been there, but sort of in practice cut off because of its non-recognition, and then it starts, that nutrition starts flooding in, then the pleasures that seem so significant become secondary. But in this case, what we're also saying, secondary but enjoyed. And the pains, secondary but endured. Yeah, it's a very nice metaphor, thanks. So going back to So just a final thing that is worth mentioning. The awakening teachings that point to the illusoriness of life, and that all there is this that arises in this present moment, and it's not an objective reality with a here and an out there. It's not a reality of time. There is no past and there is no future. There is only this. Why are they doing that? They're doing it for very good reason. It's a method by which we can bring awareness onto this right here on a very experiential level, rather than how we tend to relate to life, which is through a conceptual idea of what life is. So it's bringing attention to what is here right now, focusing the mind to see this, and in that seeing the experience as all there is, what might pop out is an aspect of the experience that is really important. One is the awareness that has to be ever present in order for experience of the present moment to exist. And the other aspect, which is not separate from awareness, but can seem like two, is the sense of being, the sense of I am. And sometimes when that is recognized, it's recognized in an impersonal sense, and we might start to think that it's the impersonality and living life from this impersonal, non-localized perspective that is the freedom. Whereas I see that the movement is a movement that takes us beyond that. The significance is the realization of the awareness and the being. The realization of something that wasn't seen previously, for a very good reason, so that it can then be recognized to be the very core of the person. That the person is essentially, one description we could say, the impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism and functioning through it as personal consciousness. Or we could just say that the person is separate and has a consciousness. And it's the consciousness of the person, the core of the person, the very nature of the core of the person that is the saving grace. Now, it doesn't, when we're familiar with our being, in, let's say, we can go into a meditation, very quickly close our eyes and drop into the center of or the core of the person, or with our eyes open, rest there. If we are really present with it to find out where it comes from, to be present with it so that it informs us of certain information, we find it doesn't inform us that that consciousness is the consciousness of some source. It informs us that the consciousness is there. That's what it informs us. It informs us, I am, I exist. But it doesn't tell us much more than that. So it could actually be the consciousness of this body. So this is going full circle. You know, the teachings tell us it is not the consciousness of the body. Why do they tell us it's not the consciousness of the body? Just so that the consciousness is recognized. It's not because recognizing that the consciousness is not of the body, that is the freedom. It's actually, the freedom is recognizing the consciousness, an aspect of life that and I'd go as far as an aspect of the human being that has gone unrecognized. So how can we know ourselves fully as a human being if the very core of the human being is unknown to us, unrecognized? Meaning we only know ourselves as the physical entity and maybe the thoughts and the emotions. I mean, that means we don't know ourselves. So an awakening to the consciousness is paramount, but in practice, it's experienced as the consciousness of the body. And I can say this because once all of those concepts were put aside, and I found myself in practice living as this person, and knowing myself as a person, meaning knowing the core of the person, the place where if I rest, which is not something you need to do intermittently during the day, it's something that can happen consistently during the day. What becomes very clear is I am. So even when circumstance doesn't work out, a remembering is I am, and circumstance is secondary. And the peace comes from not the fact that I will be tomorrow, but the fact that I am now. So the very essence of the core of the human being, which knows it is its own self-contentment. Not that it will be tomorrow. Actually, it doesn't know. When it's really honest, it doesn't know that it will be tomorrow. The concept that says the core of the human being was never born and never dies, even that's a concept that is not verifiable to us. And if our happiness depended on the fact that we were immortal, in not necessarily on a body level, but on a core level, then we'd need to know that I'm immortal. And I don't know, maybe I haven't realized something. But when I'm very present with the beingness, the core of the human being, it doesn't tell me that it's immortal. It tells me that it's timeless and spaceless in the experience of it. So as we dive deeper and deeper into the core of the human being, we find that there is no edges, no time, no space. It's a very mysterious center, but it doesn't really tell me anything definitively. And I found that this happiness, that is what everyone is looking for, is available without knowing much more than the core of the human being. It's available without knowing more than knowing I am. So I hope that today's satsang may have pointed out the significance of teachings as being there to do something particular, to undo certain errors. And at the end, life becomes very simple, where in practical terms, I find the only thing that makes sense is to live as the experience has created life to be lived, which is as a human being. And if life has delivered sufficient changes such that the human being can live in life free of suffering, then all we can do is be grateful. Thank you.